Hi everyone, my name is David Villar. I used to work at Iowa State University as a clinical toxicologist and have now been working at a university in Colombia for the past 10 years. Welcome to this presentation that will focus on the cattle fever tick that for many of you may be quite unheard of, but the principles of an integrated parasite management could well be applied to just about any type of parasite that is creating problems around the globe when it comes to raising livestock and having productive, healthy systems. I chose this picture on the background of the slide to show what a healthy cattle tick laying a nice looking clutch of eggs looks like. And as you can see, those eggs have started to hatch and the larvae are starting to crawl around that petri dish. This first slide summarizes everything that will be covered throughout the presentation, starting by setting the objectives of an integrated parasite management. We'll say a few things on the history of the cattle fever tick in the U.S. and how they managed to eradicate it from the continental U.S. If in tropical countries like Colombia, ticks play an important role maintaining endemic stability for diseases like anaplasmosis and babesiosis. So it may not be such a good idea to have cattle completely clean from ticks. In order to control ticks whenever drugs may no longer work, we will briefly revise the life cycle of the tick and what other control measures can be implemented at each one of those life stages. At least in Colombia, most drugs are no longer effective to control ticks, and I would like to show how the different mechanisms, how those parasites have become resistant. And in fact, the control practices that farmers use have done just about everything possible to speed up that resistance. And finally, we will touch on the different alternatives that can be used to control ticks whenever the acaricides no longer work. As I say, with very few exceptions, like we will show in a minute for the US, history has shown us that if we try to eradicate parasites, we're likely to fail. Parasites have coexisted with their host for thousands, if not millions of years. We can say they're part of the system and it's not in their best interest to kill the host. So in this respect, a few parasites on the animal are usually not a problem, and the goal of an integrated parasite management should be to control or reduce them below a threshold that doesn't create production losses and obviously clinical disease. And to accomplish this, there is really no ABC approach like deworming every so often, which unfortunately has been the usual practice for the past decades. My notion of an integrated parasite management is kind of the fancy term to all those management practices that we can implement to minimize the need of using antiparasitic drugs. And I often like to use this epidemiologic triad as a model to illustrate this concept. You can prevent disease by acting on the three corners of this triangle, and this is exactly what John Snow proved in the 19th century. He carried out what we would call today as shoe leather epidemiology, going from house to house in London and counting all the deaths from cholera and determining which company was supplying water to each one of those houses. And really, without knowing that the cause of death was the enterotoxic Vibrio cholera, he proved that water contaminated from the River Thames was the source of the disease. And basically, this is telling us that we don't really need to know every detail of the pathology of the agent in order to prevent disease. And without using drugs that will kill the pathogen, we can always intervene at the level of either the host by increasing its resistance, using less susceptible breeds, or, for example, vaccinating and providing adequate nutrition. And we can also intervene in the environment. In the case of Jon Snow, it was clear that avoiding drinking water contaminated from the River Thames was the answer. And in our case, it basically entails everything that we can do to break the free living stages of the ticks in the environment or the pastures where the cattle are grazing. They call John Snow the father of modern epidemiology for his work, which, as you can see, basically prove that you can prevent or control disease by disrupting the connection at any of the 3 points in this triangle. As I mentioned before, with very few exceptions, the eradication campaigns have failed in totally eliminating parasites from any country, and one of those exceptions is the one conducted in the US that within a few decades they managed to eradicate the cattle fever tick from all the southeastern states of the continental US. And without this tick, the main disease transmitted by the tick, which is babesiosis, also disappeared. And they now estimate savings of up to $3 billion a year to the cattle industry from not having this protozoal disease. And you may read more on how they make these calculations in the reference provided here below. Here we can see an old photograph from the USDA showing aspects of this cattle fever tick eradication campaign. One starting by strict quarantine, which means no movement of animals in and out of infested premises. Systematic treatment of cattle with an acaricide. At the time, they used those concrete constructions called plunge dips. They look like trenches on the ground, if you like. And when the animals would run through these constructions, they became completely immersed in the water bath with the acaricide. On the next slide, we will see a video clip of a portable dipping vat on wheels, if you like, that are now used in surveillance programs. But I would say that these concrete bunkers are kind of a relic of history now. And the third key to success of the program was pasture vacation, which basically refers to not introducing cattle in any infested pasture until all the free living stages of the tick have died. If you look at the map below, there is a strip of land at the border between Texas and Mexico, and they call it a permanent quarantine zone in which they keep inspectors doing regular visits at every cattle ranch to make sure that deer and cattle that swim across the Rio Grande are not reintroducing ticks from Mexico. And what happens when they find any infested cow with even one tick is shown partly on this short video clip. They will put that ranch in quarantine, and they will run every animal through this trailer, which, as you can see, has a dipping vat. And they do this every 15 days for 6 months. And as you can see, it's quite time-consuming, for not saying expensive operation. But it pays off, obviously, if the country is going to remain free from babesiosis. On the short video clip on the right, you can see one of the inspectors refilling up the tank with Kumafos, which is the organophosphorus pesticide they use, which, unlike the other ones, has proved to be very stable over time if they keep the pH of that water constant. So all they need to do is replenish the tank from one time to the next, and they steer it all up well with a power-driven air pump before they run the animals through the bath again. Before addressing some of the mechanisms of resistance and some of the options available to control tick infestations, a basic understanding of the life cycle is shown on this diagram. As you can see, it's a direct life cycle that may take any time between 2 months under optimum conditions all the way up to 9 months if those environmental conditions are not favorable. This becomes crucial as it gives us an idea of how long you may need to vacate or rest the pasture to clean it from the parasite. This diagram basically shows that the life stages on the animal may take anywhere between 18 to 35 days. That's from the time the tick larvae attaches to the time it's going to fall off as an engorged female. This engorged female then spends 14 days laying up to 3,000 eggs, and after 27 days of incubation, from the time they were laid, a single larvae arises and it climbs to the tip of those grass leaves, where it can stay alive a couple of months, give and take a few weeks, depending on the weather. If the temperature is low, what happens is that the metabolism of the ticks basically slows, and that tends to expand the life cycle, as I mentioned earlier. So that's something that we always have to keep in mind, because it's going to make a big difference on the number of generations that you have on any given year. We estimate that we have between 4 and 5 cycles, at least in our tropical part of the world. The way I recommend control programs for ticks depends basically on what you see on this figure. In areas of low incidence of babesiosis, like we have on the high plains of the Andes, those are areas above 6,000 feet above over the sea level. It's still too cold for the tick to survive, and basically, if you were to sample those cows, they're all going to be seronegative for babesia. So basically, there is no endemic stability, and the aim should be basically to eradicate down to the last tick that you may find on any ranch. And because we want to eradicate ticks, this is really the only situation where I would break the rule of applying target selective treatment. And I advise to treat 100% of the animals in the ranch and at the same time treat the pastures for all the free living stages of the tick, which I truly hate doing because most of the agricultural pesticides that we will use will kill pretty much everything, not only the target tick parasites, but all the beneficial insects and of interest to us. As you go down in altitude and the number of ticks and the inoculation rate increases of babesia, ideally you want 100% of those animals to seroconvert to babesia in order to achieve what we would call a state of endemic stability, in which basically all the animals have been exposed and have high levels of antibodies that are protecting against babesia. So as you can see, when there is endemic stability, the incidence of cases is low, usually in those animals that have not been exposed to ticks in the first year of life. And obviously, the higher incidence of cases a year is going to take place in places in between, where you have many animals that are seronegative, and any spike in the number of ticks will be enough to inoculate enough babesia to cause disease. So in areas of endemic stability or low altitude, I tend to worry when I don't see a few ticks on those cows, and I tell farmers to avoid treating animals until the numbers of ticks is high enough to cause disease by themselves. This is kind of a judgment call, I know. I tend to guide myself by the condition of the skin and the number of ticks that you see on that animal to decide whether it requires treatment or should be left alone. But you, as I say, you definitely want to have a few ticks on those animals to act as a vaccine for babesia. You may want to stop this slide and read it, but it basically tells you that the role played by ticks in endemic areas is important, and the objectives is to prevent outbreaks of disease by babesia, because, as I mentioned, we don't have a vaccine available in the country. And ideally, what you want is to have calves exposed to ticks prior to being 9 months of age, because unlike other parasitic diseases, calves have an innate immunity which protects them from babesia until they're at least 9 months of age or younger. If we move on to how ticks become resistant, there are several mechanisms. I'm going to use permethrin, which is a pyrethroid that has been well studied and for which there is probably no tick left in Colombia that can be killed anymore. Pyrethroids bind to the sodium voltage gated channel, and they open it, causing depolarization of the parasite neurons. So let's assume for a minute that you need to open, let's say, 50 out of 100 of those channels to kill a tick. When you start using the chemical for the first time, you will notice that not all the ticks require the same dosage. Some will be more susceptible, and other ones will require a little bit more to be killed. So the ideal dose should be one that is going to kill obviously 100% of the population in that animal. And the reason why some are more susceptible than other ones, to make this somewhat easier to comprehend, is because there will be individuals that have 100% of those target proteins with both parent alleles that are susceptible. But as you move to the right of that curve, you notice that you start finding alleles from one of the parents that starts coding for a protein which permethrin is unable to bind. In other words, a resistant protein. And as you can tell, at the further end of the curve, we can still kill the parasite because you can increase the dose to bind at least 50 of those 100 target proteins. But as you can see at this point, the resistant allele is now being expressed to a much greater extent. Now, if you notice, there are two circles outside of the curve, and basically there is a point in which we create so much selection pressure by repeating using that chemical over and over to the point in which basically no matter how much you increase the dose, it's going to be impossible to kill those ticks anymore. Because all the target proteins have become now resistant. Obviously, those resistant parasites are the ones that are not going to be killed by the treatment. They will be the ones mating and passing on their genes to the next generation that will also be resistant. So if you understood this concept, the one on this other slide is going to be very simple to comprehend. I pose the question of where does resistance emerges first when using a drug like fenbendazole that is rapidly cleared from bloodstream, or when we use an insecticide like ivermectin that, as you can see, and depending also on the formulation and the dosage, can stay in the body for up to 3 months. In this graph, the duration of action that kills 100% of the parasites could be expressed by the time at which the concentrations in plasma are above the lethal dose, which is expressed as a blue line here, and is clearly much longer for the endectocide than it is for fenbendazole. However, if we really wanted to choose one that will not favor the development of resistance, we'd rather have one with a curve like fenbendazole instead of one with the red line. What happens in the part of the red line curve that is below the lethal dose in blue is that we're going to kill most of the susceptible worms that you see here in the population, that is those that have both alleles being susceptible, and the ones that are heterogeneous with one allele of each kind will survive, and that's obviously going to increase the overall resistant gene on the next generation. So basically, in conclusion, if we want to an antiparasitic from the standpoint of slowing resistance, we would rather choose one that is going to act quickly and just as fast is going to be eliminated from the body, hopefully in a matter of a few days. I'm also going to use this slide to make another point, which is interesting, and that's how we see resistance taking place in any one farm. This is not an overnight phenomenon. It's a slow process. Let's imagine that for a minute that we have killed all the double S susceptible ticks, and now 50% of the population are totally resistant, and the other 50% is heterogeneous RS ticks. So now when you apply ivermectin, the first month in which the concentrations are going to be above the blue line, you will notice that the number of ticks killed on the animal is about half of those that should be killed if they were all susceptible. In other words, the therapeutic efficacy is being reduced by half because you can only kill the heterogeneous population at this point. But the duration of action is another thing that is also going to be reduced because in the second month that the concentrations are decreasing, now all the double S susceptibles have disappeared, and basically all the ticks that remain in the farm are either double R resistant or heterogeneous, and neither one of them can now be killed with those lower concentrations. And we have proved this in some of our in vivo and in vitro studies, and you can read more about this on these references that we provide here. So to wrap up this idea and visualize what happens in any one farm, the scientific community now recognizes the importance of maintaining what's known as the population in refugia, which basically accounts for all the parasites in a farm, including all the free living stages that are not being exposed to an antiparasitic drug. On this illustration, taken from a recent manual entitled Control of Worms Sustainably, we can see that when we use a drug for the first time, ideally selecting those animals that are more heavily parasitized, which may only be like 20% of the entire herd. There may be already a few resistant parasites, which are represented here with a red line. At first, we will kill most of the parasites with the drug, and basically the next generation that will infest the animal, which is represented here with a green color, will also be susceptible to the same drug. If you notice, the number of parasites in the farm is being expressed on a log scale. So basically, for every one parasite inside the animal, you may have thousands, if not millions, out there on the pasture. Basically, if we continue using this same drug, what is going to happen is that those resistant parasites that may be almost non-existent at the very beginning will be the ones that are going to replicate on the animal, and they're going to pass on their genes to the next generation. So as you can deduce, over time the number of resistant ones will tend to increase because we're removing all the susceptible ones from the farm. So the take-home message should be that we don't really want to remove all the population in the future because that will speed up the appearance of resistance. With regards to the molecular mechanisms by which ticks become resistant, I'm going to refer you to the Veterinary Medicine Academy site below if you're interested to know in detail the different types of mechanisms that exist. It would take me probably the rest of the presentation to talk about them, and I would rather show you some aspects of the integrated parasite management that we can use when drugs are no longer effective. So I'm going to skip this next couple of slides and go to this one that shows three methods of control for the cattle tick in Colombia. As I say, each one on its own is making its contribution to speed up the problem of resistance by removing the population in refuge. In every case, they're applying the same type of chemical, which is FIPRONIL, which is marketed with the trade name of Regent. And we have the animal version, which is marketed as Allianz. And by applying fipronil on that pasture, what is happening is that the largest population of ticks, which is present as larvae in the pasture, is being wiped out at once, leaving just only a few resistant ones that may always be present to be the ones that will obviously climb on the animals. This is likely the fastest method to speed up resistance because we're truly removing at once the largest population of susceptible ticks on this farm. On the second case, you notice they're applying Allianz on the back line of that ZEBU cow on that chute. And by doing so, not only are they wasting their money because this breed is resistant to most external parasites in the tropics, but they're also treating an animal that may allow a few of those susceptible ticks to survive and therefore maintain part of the so-called population in refuge. The fact that they're resistant to ticks does not really mean that a few ticks will still be able to infest the animal and manage to successfully complete their cycle. If you look at the flap of skin on the chest of that cow, all those pinpoint dots are small ticks. I took this picture because this is probably the most number of ticks that you're likely to find on ZEBU cows. Really, only a few of those ticks will eventually manage to become adult females. There is really very little, if any, harm being done to this animal. If you look at the skin, it looks in great condition, and therefore there is no need to treat this animal. And at the same time, as I say, it serves to maintain some of those susceptible ticks on the farm to preserve the population in refuge. We will see in a minute what's considered a resistant breed, and it doesn't necessarily imply that they will repel all the ticks that climb on the animal. Finally, if we look at what the rural farmer is doing, he's hand spraying Regent. This is intended for using plants and not animals, but farmers claim it's effective and cheaper than buying aliens. So in this case, I would argue that what they should do is ensure that they wet the animal thoroughly, starting with the legs and working its way up all around the animal, and particularly in areas where the ticks tend to concentrate that are usually not visible in between the legs. This was not being done here, and he was also distributing this 20-liter backpack sprayer on more than 10 animals, when in reality each one of those backpack is intended for only 4 or 5 animals. So in this case the treatment dose is below the recommended one, which is also another factor that will favor the appearance of resistance. Because they're only removing the most susceptible ones, and they're going to leave behind those that already have a resistant allele. For those of you that wonder what a massive infestation of ticks looks like, on this short video clip we see a 3-year-old Simmental bull that was referred to us with repeated infestations by ticks. You can notice all the engorged ticks on that animal. This was a case of pure animal neglect, but with all the resistant to most acrosites in the area, we applied a combination of 3 different ones that work by different mechanisms. And as you can see on this short video clip below, it would seem like he was living in a real paradise for any cow. But in reality, this type of breed, Simmentals, do not belong to tropical areas because of the high temperatures and the problems they get with these tropical parasites like ticks. The same animal 10 days after one of those massive infestations. And as you can notice, there are a lot of skin lesions that are left by those ticks. Many scabs throughout the body. The skin was really itchy to the point that all those hemorrhagic areas that you see were self-inflicted by the animal by just rubbing and scratching himself against every tree and fence post on those premises. When we talk about the biology of the ticks, it's important to mention that they need suitable plants that will favor the attachment to the host. And in this case, the plants that they were used as forage were the African star grass and some species of signal grass. And both of them make it really easy for that tick larvae to climb to the top and just wait for the animal to attach as it walks by. The other problem that wounds create by ticks is that they become ideal grounds for fly larvae like the screwworm, which is renowned for its eating living tissue in just about any warm-blooded animal. And in fact, the name of this blowfly is Cochleomya hominivorax, which literally translates as man-eating blowfly. And you can see an example on the breast of this Brangus cow, that the lesions that were left by the ticks were now breeding grounds for this blowfly, and there is a clear opening in that scheme by the invading screwworm larvae. Now, going back to the concept of applying integrated parasite management, if we look at the things that we could do on the part of the host, the number one by far would be to select for resistant breeds, like the ZEBUs that you see on this photograph. These animals have an innate, inborn, or naturally inherited resistance, if you like, to the tick. So if you see a cow with a hump on the shoulders, a large flap of skin below the neck, which is known as the dewlap, and they have kind of droopy ears, you're basically looking at a pretty resistant animal for ticks. Another alternative is to select animals within its own breed that harbor the less number of ticks. And there is a really neat study done on a susceptible breed called the Australian Illawarra Shorthorn, which is shown here on the lower photograph, in which they were basically calling animals with ticks and keeping those that were least infested. And within a matter of 4 generations, that resistant in that farm went from 89.2% to 99%. They basically achieved the same resistance as if they had crossed one of those susceptible cows with a pure ZEBU stud bull in just 1 generation. And you can read more about these studies on the reference that I'm providing here below. With regards to nutrition, there are no really specific studies that relate the impact it may have on the ability of the animal to repel ticks. If we rely basically on field observations, you will see that there is really a large variation in the number of ticks within a group of animals. And my personal observation is that the ones with the poorest body condition or that have any other health problem, they seem to be the most heavily infested ones. Another means to increase immunity of the host is with vaccines. Believe it or not, there are vaccines against the cattle tick that will not only lower the number of ticks on the animal, but also lowers the reproductive capacity of that tick. In other words, those ticks that still manage to drop as engorged females will produce less number of eggs, and many of those eggs will be infertile. Here you can see the Australian version, which is marketed as Tick Guard, and we also have the Cuban, which is known as Gabac. They're both based on a BM86 antigen from the midgut of the tick, which is obviously concealed to the immune system of the animal. So you actually need to repeat and give booster vaccinations basically every 6 months to provide adequate protection. Unfortunately, in Colombia, the regulatory counterpart of the FDA in the US will grant approval and registration to many products with no proven record of or studies of efficacy and safety. Here we see the vaccine, which is currently approved for more than a decade. And not only us, but independent researchers outside of the country have also shown it to be worthless. The only study available is not even presented in a scientific journal. This ACOVES magazine is a local trade magazine for farmers and veterinarians, and they report amazing results in terms of reduction in the number of tick counts on the animal, egg production, and reduction in eclosion rates. In my opinion, everything mentioned here was fabricated, and something kind of smells fishy about the whole thing, but it's not really worth spending more time talking about it. Moving on to another corner of the triangle, let's see what could be done to attack the parasite on the animal apart from the usual conventional drugs. I took this picture in one of the local farms. After these cows were manually milked every day, some of them would even lay down, and these chickens would simply jump on the animal and groom them from ticks. You can notice by the color of those feathers that this rooster was definitely well fed, and it seemed like the cow was acknowledging his work and was happy to have that chicken there. There are also some birds in Colombia that will stay close to cattle and will do the same thing. However, I would argue that it's very unlikely that using only birds we can really tip the balance to achieve a proper control on the population of ticks. And I put a question mark on those ants that are apparently carrying some eggs, because if there is really a carnivore ant or insect that could prey on the eggs or the tick of the ticks or their tiny larvae, that would no doubt be a formidable weapon that we could potentially use, at least in places where the antiparasitics no longer work. Another type of biological control agents are these fungal pesticides. There is really a large body of literature on this topic, and I would say they hold a lot of promise, but at the moment they have only shown good results in laboratory settings, and when used on field trials, they have not really measured up to the expectations. There are a number of funguses like this Metarrhizium anisopliae, whose spores will attach to the cuticle of the tick, and when they germinate, they penetrate and invade the structures of the tick, and eventually basically destroy all the organs inside. The one thing about these funguses is that they're not specific to ticks, so we don't really know their impact on other organisms that may not be target and could have beneficial effects. As you can see, this Metarrhizium has been found to be pathogenic to at least 2,000 different species of insects. Unfortunately, in the Colombian market, we have a really large number of these so-called biological fungal pesticides. Some of them are approved, like the ones on the left, and the other ones are kind of in the black market for use against ticks in cattle. In particular, both of these ones that you see here, we did a field control study, and neither one of them showed any efficacy whatsoever. This other slide shows another one, which is sold in the black market and can be found in almost every farm around the country. It's an injectable formulation that claims to be a natural pyrethrin against both endo and ecto parasites. We did some HPLC analysis and found a concentration of 10.5% ivermectin, and by using the dose recommended in the label, the animals are receiving a dosage of 2,100 micrograms per kilogram body weight, which is 4 times the maximum recommended dose by any approved ivermectin on the market anywhere in the world. To make things worse, the label also claims that the product doesn't really create any residues on milk or the carcass of the animal, so there is no need for withdrawal times. And this is obviously a clear violation of the law because the consumers, at least in Colombia, are being exposed to this drug, and who knows what other ones. And we have denounced this situation several years ago to the Drug Regulatory Agency, and as far as I know, nothing has been done to crack down on this illicit market. Here is another one. This time is a pour-on formulation against ticks and flies that basically claims to do everything under the sun except for what it truly does. At least for ticks, I'm not so sure about flies. And at the moment, we have probably just as many illicit drugs on the market as legally approved ones. Finally, if we move into things that could be done on the pasture to control the free living stages of the tick, we have some principles that could also be applied to many other parasites. In the case of the cattle tick, a clean or safe pasture is one that has never been grazed by cattle. This one ties up with the second one, which is to put cattle in pastures that have been grazed by other type of livestock, sheep, goats, horses, because neither one of these other species can serve as a host for the cattle tick. The third one is a pasture that has not been grazed by cattle for more than 4 or 5 months. I must point out that this is a time frame that we apply in our tropical weather conditions. I know that in the US they used to vacate or rest pastures for more than 6 months. If a pasture is heavily infested, we could easily clean it by doing any of the following practices, which are basically dedicating that land to something different from grazing with animals. We could either harvest grass for making bales of hay or a silage crop. We could renovate that pasture using tillage practices. It seems logical that any mechanical agitation of the soil will bury and kill all the free living stages of most parasites. We could also rotate the use of a pasture with planting row crops. And finally, there are some options like burning and using annual instead of perennial plants. I borrowed these 2 photographs from Susan Shanian from the University of Maryland with examples of 2 practices for the control of roundworms in small ruminants. But the idea could be equally relevant for the cattle tick. The first one is to alternate grazing between cattle and sheep since they do not share the same types of parasites, with a very few exceptions, maybe like the liver fluke. So basically one species will serve to decontaminate the pasture from the other one. The other example is a recent plantation of pearl millet, which is a cereal crop that stands drought conditions better than many of the other ones like corn or wheat. And there is one option that was not included in the previous list, which is using alternative forages. This has proved to reduce the parasite load of roundworms in sheep and goats. Unfortunately, we don't have similar good experiences to control the cattle tick. And just as I mentioned with the fungal pesticides, there are extraordinary studies showing good results in vitro, but they were all done in laboratory settings with experimental plots, and then when taken to field conditions, they didn't really perform as expected. One was published in Nature back in 1982. They evaluated the anti-tick properties of different species of the tropical alfalfa, Stylothansis, and they did so by infesting experimental plots with a known number of larvae, and then they drugged flannel cloth to see how many of those ticks could be recovered from the top of the plants. Basically, the stems and leaves of these plants are covered with what are called glandular trichomes that produce sticky secretions, and those secretions are either lethal to the larvae or they simply trap them, preventing from ascending further up. These are obviously mechanisms of defense that plants have against feeding insects, and I would say that the effect on ticks could be considered as incidental. My opinion is that in order for these plants to have a potential use in field conditions, they would probably need to dominate among any other grass species on any sward, and don't leave really ticks any other options but try to climb on these ones. Otherwise, probably the impact is probably going to be limited. And having said this, I must point that Stylothansis makes an excellent tropical legume. Is native to South America, has high nutritional value. So if a large percentage of the ground was covered on any field, it would probably be a good part of an integrated parasite management for the tick. Another one is that is native to Africa, but is well established in South America, is the molasses grasses. And when this grass was grown as a monoculture, it was highly lethal and repellent to those larvae of cattle ticks. As you can notice, it has long trichomes or hairs on the stems and leaves that basically will immobilize the movement of ticks. Just imagine yourself trying to climb Mountain Everest without any climbing gear. It'd probably be a suicide mission. So this was my final slide. I appreciate the opportunity given by the organizing committee and the sponsors of the event. I hope you enjoyed and found the information useful to whatever your interest may be. And please feel free to contact me at the address provided here if I can be of any assistance. So thanks again, and bye-bye for now.